I'd like to share a little bit about the ethics of permaculture, because for me, it's a way that you approach everything you see when you have and you put on glasses that have the lens of permaculture in it, and which hold the ethics and the principles that guide this system called permaculture. And when I think of ethics, I go back to a place for me that when I think of earth care, when I think of people care, when I think of fair share, and I think of how when I first heard those, it was at a time when we were starting a site in California that was for young people who were learning nature awareness skills. We had a program working with homeless youth in the Santa Barbara, California area. And we were seeing kids who were having all of their days spent inside on concrete, and if they were lucky, they could go out into a park, but the parks were engineered. And the parks were not the wild lands. And my wife and I were learning about tracking, we were learning about origin skills of our ancestors, we were learning a lot about the indigenous peoples. And we started to take these kids out on these programs to track cougars and to track wild bears and coyotes. And we would go out into the woods where we would take them from the city, and we would learn about patterns in the landscape, and had some of these amazing experiences with these kids. And one thing led to another, and we started a program for kids to learn about having awareness of the world around them and having an appreciation or a stewardship ethic that was about tending the land for a time beyond your own. And I stop and I have to think about that. So much of the world around us, so many people in the world around us are living in a way where they steal from their grandchildren to feed themselves today. And when I start to look ahead, I have to ask, what are the steps, what are the things that I'm touching in my life to sustain myself? And what are the effects of those, the way that I'm sustaining myself on future generations? And it led me down a trail of what is an ethic that considers future generations. And when those thoughts were going through my head, and my wife's head, we came in contact with this movement called permaculture. And permaculture spoke a stewardship ethic that was not just for the people, but also for the earth, and also for a way where we return any surplus that we produce with our highly productive systems back into the system as almost a form of philanthropy. And I got so excited about it because it's a way of living, and it's a way of looking at everything else around you. It's looking and saying, wow, is what I'm doing right now tending the earth? Is my primary client as a permaculture designer is the earth? And then from there, I know people are healthier if the earth is healthy. I travel all over the world, and when you see erosion in the landscape, you know there's erosion in the cultural scape as well. So I know that for people to be healthy, happy, vibrant, to have a life of meaning, there needs to be an ecology that's healthy, vibrant, and that has meaning in the people's world. And so those ethics made a lot of sense to me. And it led to us sharing this with kids. And more the kids, we'd go out on these programs into the wilderness, and then they would come back and they would go to the homeless shelter in the city, and they'd be like, Mom, we don't have to be here at all. Let's go build a debris hut in the wilderness and we'll live under leaves. And, the moms are like, oh no, what am I doing? My kid, it's good that he's going out there, but we can't live like that. And so it started this tension of how do we live in a modern day? How do we live within cities, within suburban landscapes, within even rural landscapes where there's villages, in a way that has those ethics embedded in them, not just when we're out in the land on a wilderness program, but when we're in the city. And that tension, out of that tension came a permaculture site that has been the place where I cut my teeth in design and application, called Quail Springs. And I want to tell a story about Quail Springs because it has to do with the ethics of buildings. And when we started to realize that in America, the average house in America has 10,000 or more embedded toxic chemicals in it. There's a wonderful book called The Healthy House that speaks to this. And some houses, they've found 15, 20,000 toxic chemicals in it. And in the average house, we're saying 10,000 toxic chemicals. And I was realizing, here are these kids, they go out, they have a wilderness experience, and they have a stewardship ethic, and then they come back to a house that is going to kill them eventually. And ethically, I was torn there, because in America, the latest cancer statistics, they share that that 1/3 of all women will get some form of cancer in America. So 1 in 3, they say, will get some form of cancer in America. And men, 1 in 2. So half of all the men in America are going to get some form of cancer, according to the latest American Cancer Society statistics. And that 1 in 5 will die of cancer. So 20% of the people in America will die of cancer. And more through the Center for Disease Control in America, we're finding that a lot of the chemicals that we have around us are actually causing that. It's an industrial disease. I mean, cancer's been here for a long time, but now it's at an epidemic stage that's being heightened by industrial chemification of our environment, not just in our food, but in our houses as well. And so I'm thinking about this: care of the earth, care of the people, and fair share. And I'm seeing, here it is, homeless people want to have a house. I mean, that's what they're striving for, and yet the houses that we're saying you can live in are ones that will kill you, or potentially could kill you. And so part of what we did at Quail Springs was we said, let's start by looking at shelter. And it happens that in wilderness survival, we call it the sacred order of survival. You start with shelter. You always start with shelter. If you're lost in the woods, the first thing you look for is shelter. Not water, not food, not fire, but shelter. Because most people die in actually not very cold conditions. They get a little wet and they get hypothermia, and they don't have shelter, and they're out there for a few nights. And most people die in the woods because they don't have actual shelter. So we always say start with shelter, and then we go to water, and then we go to fire, and then you can cook your food. And so, or shelter, fire, water, food. And in that, we thought we would do the same at our permaculture site. So we started to look at, well, what can we build a home out of? You know, the average home in America has a 30-year mortgage on it. And a mortgage is a contract that the very words mortgage is, the root of it is a death contract. That here it is, you have 30 years you spend paying most of the money to the bank. And at the end of it, the houses that are being built in America, they also fall apart in 30 years, so it has to be rebuilt. And there's a lot of statistics showing that the modern house in America is timed to fall apart right when the mortgage is done paying, so that a new mortgage has to rebuild the house. So you start to see that a lot of the ethics embedded in that are not about earth care, people care, and fair share, but they're all about making profit and economics. And so at Quail Springs, we started to research, well, how could we build within our ethics? And it was so exciting to see, because what we found is we had to look at what was available locally. First thing, what's available locally? because we found that the less money we spend, the more regenerative the system we built was, or the more sustainable it was. So think about that for a minute. The more money you throw into a project, oftentimes that brings in a lot of outside resources. And so that system becomes less regenerative or less sustainable because it's dependent on outside resources. So people that have very little money, I'm finding, can build very ecologically sound houses if they look to their environment. And so we started to do this, and we found out in the deserts of Quail Springs, in the deserts, the high mountain deserts behind Santa Barbara, we had the perfect clay, sand, and then we could get straw that was grown locally, and we could mix it together to create what we call a cob, which is a mixture that you see a lot of buildings in Europe are made out of this, and we could thread it together to make these beautifully elegant houses with beautiful plasters, with micaceous clays that glisten in the light, and earthen floors that are done in such a way you can actually mop them and they don't wash away. And they're houses that have very little cost to them because they're made from the local environment. And the more we started to build these homes, the more we realized they were energy efficient. So we could also lessen the cost of what it takes to keep it cool in the summer and warm in the winter by just orienting that building to the sun for that altitude or that latitude, and to be able to orient it so it gets the winter light, but then during the summer, no summer sun actually shines through any window. And we could keep our houses cool in the really hot summers of the desert and keep them warm in the really cold winters of our winters there, or keep them warm in the really cold winters that we have. And more we started to see that what we were doing was accessible by children. Children could actually build on a work site that you're working with mud, as opposed to all these saws and pneumatic guns that were shooting nails and all of these different things that were that actually legally prohibit children from working on websites. We could actually bring children into job sites. So more and more I share this story because for us the ethics had to do with how we live with them. It's not about what we project on other people, but how we model them. And the more we were able to model the ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share for the children, the more we saw them actually take them up into their own lives.